Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Kendall. It's been a busy year at Bowling Green State University regarding activity on Lake Erie. The opening of the Center for Great Lakes Research and Watershed Studies, the launching of the research vessel RV Ziggy, just recently a panel on the future of Lake Erie and the Great Lakes. And joining me today are two faculty members in the BGSU Department of Biology, Dr. George Bullerjahn and Dr. Timothy Davis. I want to thank both of you for being here today.
Pleasure.
Busy year and a lot going on. So let's talk about, first of all, you just did a panel recently, the future of Lake Erie. So talk a little bit about what went on with that, because that just happened a week or so ago. What was the focus of that? Obviously we're trying to figure out the future and all the environmental issues that we face with the lake.
Well, it was part of a broader program for the fall semester, which actually started with the book on the Flint water crisis. And so a lot of the students and sort of academic programming was centered around water quality for the whole semester. And this is sort of the last event of that program. And so I moderated a panel which included Tim as and two other faculty, Angelica Vasquez Ortega and Luis Stevenson from Bowling Green, and then a number of other stakeholders from the community, which included Tom Henry from the Blade, water quality policy folks, and local artists who are, sort of the link, sort of communicating water issues to the general public. And so, Tim can talk about the scientific things that were addressed there.
Yeah. And so what way out?
And a farmer. We had a farmer.
Yes, of course.
Right.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was a great panel. We really just talked about, what is the future of Lake Erie? How are we going to go about trying to solve some of Lake Erie's water quality problems when it comes to dealing with these, toxic cyanobacterial blooms.
Right.
And the reason why we had such a diverse panel is because, it's going to take a multifaceted effort. And really, if we want to solve the problems in Lake Erie, it's going to start in the watershed. So being able to talk to farmers about what, these initiatives like the H2 Ohio Fund that Governor DeWine just announced a couple days ago, how those programs are meant to help stimulate some of the activities in the watershed that are going to help reduce the nutrient input into Lake Erie, which will, reduce the bloom impact. That was a key talking point, and it generated a lot of great discussion. And then how do we take what we know as scientists and communicate that to the public? That's a key part of our research and part of our jobs that, quite frankly, we could all improve at.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. And I guess because we've been talking about this, as you guys know, and you've been dealing with it a lot longer than we have. We started doing programs on this 7, 8, 9 years ago. Are we? And I know are we better off than we were then? I mean, we have obviously learned a lot. Have we really impacted the lake in a significant way, in a positive way, or are we still in those early stages of trying to get us on the right track? Because it seems like every few years, every governor comes in with a new initiative on how to fix Lake Erie, especially. So, where are we better than we were? Or are we still kind of literally treading water out there?
I think the level of awareness is permeated everywhere. Okay. And I think we all realize that it's a decade-long problem,
right.
And it's nothing that can be fixed within the lifespan of a governor's term in office.
Right.
And so that's one reason why I think the H2 Ohio initiative is a good thing. It really has a fairly long vision. There's a lot of work that's been going on both in the water where Tim and I are mostly working, but there's a lot of work in the watershed. The use of fertilizer is going down. And there are folks who are developing land use models, and they come close to achieving the kinds of nutrient reductions that we really need to see. Okay. And so there's lots of things. So there are lots of things going on that Tim can add to. So
because I know, like I say, we talk about it, and I guess if in information awareness, building that consensus so that everybody realizes they're a stakeholder in this and they understand their role in it. And the watershed, the Maumee River watershed, the Sandusky River watershed, all of that feeding in there. when we look at, and you know, you've launched this research vessel, what's really the purpose, what's its direct impact going to be on dealing with things in the lake?
Yeah, so that was a generous gift from Pat and Debbie Ryan, the Ryan family, who've been great supporters of the Department of Biological Sciences for many years. And the purpose behind acquiring that vessel was to allow Bowling Green State University to become one of the major research universities on the lake. Now, for many years, George, myself, Mike McKay, others have been doing work, within Sandusky Bay and out in Lake Erie, and we've always had to rely on others to get out onto the lake. So this vessel gives our students and faculty the opportunity to conduct the research they need to conduct when they need to conduct it.
So a lot more flexibility and the timeliness that you can go there when you want to go out there.
Absolutely, and one region that we're specifically focusing on is Sandusky Bay. We tend to focus on the bloom that's out in the open waters of western Lake Erie, and for good reason. It's a big bloom, it's toxic, it impacts, 2 states, and a Canadian province, but there's also a bloom that occurs every year in Sandusky Bay that's lasts longer and potentially, and is more toxic than the one out in the lake for the most part. And we're still learning a lot about that bloom, and Bowling Green State University has been a leader in studying that system for many years. So this vessel allows us to continue the work that we're doing in that system and expand our research to areas where we weren't able to access before because we didn't have our own vessel. So this, especially for our students, it opens up so many opportunities for them to get involved in meaningful research in areas where we couldn't provide access for them before. So it's a great opportunity for students at the university.
And it really serves and improves the partnerships we have with the state agencies, Ohio EPA, Ohio Department of Natural Resources, in that we've been using ODNR vessels, and now we have our own, and it expands our reach there. But what ODNR is going to be a recipient of these, quite a bit of the H2 Ohio funds, and what they've made a commitment to us to really do a lot of baseline monitoring for the bay, such that we can really see what sorts of restoration efforts are working. And so when they implement a long-term plan, we have the baseline data to actually see, okay, what's working, what isn't, and so adjustments can be made along the way. And without a research vessel that can go out there weekly, daily if we need to, those sorts of baseline studies really are not as good as they could be.
Sure.
So.
Yeah. The and when you look at that from the state of Ohio's perspective, you just mentioned H2 Ohio. A lot of input from folks like you into that plan to make sure that it addresses what needs to be addressed versus there are obviously issues beyond the scientific that we have to deal with that as well. But you guys people like you and yourselves were involved in helping develop that plan a little bit, or at least your data, your input infiltrated into that to some degree.
The governor did describe it as a public-private partnership. There's a private sector investors involved in this as well, and then he specifically mentioned the university in his rollout comments on last Thursday.
So and as part of that rollout plan, my colleague Angelica Vasquez Ortega and I are heading down to Columbus tomorrow to participate in a panel that will, along with the State Department, Ohio Department of Agriculture, Ohio EPA, Ohio Department of Natural Resources, we'll work together with them. They'll discuss the proposed activities, and the rollout of this plan to the research partners, and then we can provide feedback so that it is a true, public-private partnership in that sense. So that's going to happen tomorrow, and it's going to be a first of many conversations, because obviously as this program gets rolled out and the money starts to be utilized in the ways that they see fit, and that the research community has a say in that. So it is. We're excited about this initiative, at least I am, and I think it has a lot of potential.
Good. Well, when we come back, we can talk a little about a couple of the centers that here at the university that are specifically targeted at the watershed and the lake. We'll be back in just a moment with Dr. George Bullerjahn and Dr. Timothy Davis. Back in just a moment. Thanks for staying with us. We're focusing on Bowling Green State University's research on Lake Erie and the Lake Erie watershed. Our guests are Dr. George Bullerjahn and Dr. Timothy Davis. There are a couple of centers, we mentioned them early on. There's the Great Lakes Center for Fresh Waters and Human Health at the university, and there's a Center for Great Lakes and Watershed Studies. So let's talk about the Center for Fresh Waters and Human Health, and let's break down the difference between those two. They both have very specific purposes, both part of the game. So let's talk about fresh waters and human health to begin with.
Okay, so the way Tim and I like to describe it is that the Centers for Freshwater and Human Health is sort of a short game issue.
Okay.
And the long game is the center, the Center for
Great Lakes and
Great Lakes and
Watershed Studies.
It rolls off the tongue very easily.
That's right.
So the first center, the Great Lakes Center for Freshwaters and Human Health, is a 5-year, $5 million grant that was awarded by the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health to basically fund a number of research projects with Bowling Green and a number of collaborating institutions, so 8 collaborating institutions. So the money comes to Bowling Green, and it is about half of it comes here to drive research projects on campus, and then about half of it goes to other partners we've been working with. And so this really emerged. There's a program at the NIH and the NSF called Centers for Oceans and Human Health. And the National Science Foundation considers the Great Lakes as inland seas. Okay. So that counts as being eligible in that program.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so it's a 5-year grant that is renewable, but basically it's a focused series of research projects that really are an extension of this research that's been going on since the Toledo water crisis. Okay. And so most of it's in-lake related stuff, and is as basically in a termination date of 5 years after its inception. Mm-hmm. So we just started our second year of 5, so we have 4 more years to go with that.
Yeah. Now, what would be some of the examples of some of the things you'd be doing out there under this particular banner?
Well, there are 3 general research projects. One deals with what are the environmental drivers of the different bloom types that we see. We see a bloom caused by Planktothrix nearshore. We see a microcystis bloom is the dominant one you see offshore. And then there are these other blooms caused by a third organism called Dolichospermum in the Central Basin. So why do these certain blooms form where they do? That's one. That's okay. One. 2 actually looks at tries to understand all the different kinds of metabolites these toxic cyanobacteria make, with the idea is that do we know all the toxins that are made? And I would guess the answer is no. And then secondly, could some of these secondary metabolites actually be put to good use, and could they be therapeutics or developed into that? And then the third project is something that Tim is closely involved in, is what are the best ways to detect blooms and their toxicity? And because there are a number of different technologies that can be deployed at different times and for different purposes that can tell us about blooms, their toxicity, where they're headed, and how best to inform the public. And so basically it's an in-water thing. Mm-hmm. Right. And then when Tim can talk about his center as heading up into the watershed.
Yeah. Now, when we're talking about that ballpark, how many people are generally from the university, students and faculty members, involved in that kind of research? Because we have students obviously working with you on this.
I have 4 students. Tim, you have 5, and a postdoc, and so I would say engaging everybody, it's 12 to 15, somewhere in there.
And this discussion too, a lot of this research, or at least discussions about it, falls into classroom presentation too, because it deals with the people who are interested in pursuing this as a career, being involved in helping solve these problems. So there is application at the classroom level as well.
Yeah, I'm talking on Thursday. I'm giving 2 lectures to Nathan Hensley's environmental studies class. So and it enters into our microbiology curriculum as well. You teach environmental micro.
Yeah, so a lot of the concepts that get covered in these classes, you know, we also can show them, you know, the applied aspect of what they learn, which is really critical, right?
Sure.
So it's not just all textbook and conceptual. A lot of the research, actually, I would say 90% or greater of the research that we conduct here is applied, right? The research that we engage in at BGSU is meant to inform policy. It's meant to inform decision makers. It's meant to, you know, not just be science for science sake, but science for, you know, the public good and public benefit.
Sure, sure. And that's important too, because a lot of times, you know, research can be labeled as, oh, it doesn't really have any real world application. This really does. It really drives down to the point where it touches exactly what everybody's concerned about, and is a scientific basis for making decisions at the state level, the federal level, versus people operating on emotional reaction or political reactions to it. So,
absolutely. And we can't, you know, obviously we can't stop the emotional or political reactions, but what we can do is we can provide the data that helps them make those decisions. And a perfect example is that, you know, the work that BGSU and our partner universities has done has really helped us be able to come up with the first quantitative metrics for an impairment designation of a large water body due to cyanobacterial harmful algal blooms based on the Clean Water Act. This was the first one in the nation, and you know, Ohio was, you know, in court battles because of that. And they came to their researchers and said, well, we need a quantitative metrics to be able to determine whether or not Lake Erie is in fact impaired, because once you label it impaired, you need to be able to, at some way, determine it not to be impaired any longer, hopefully, if these, you know, watershed management practices work.
Because there have been initiatives on the political side to do that, and it's like, well, what's the definition of impaired? And that's what this gets us
definition
to.
Of impaired, and how do we measure it?
And how do we measure it, and how do we then measure moving away from it?
Absolutely, 15 years of research, right, and be able to synthesize that down into a impairment metric framework, which was published in a scientific journal and is, you know, an example that is cited, you know, across the country for impairment designation of a large lake due to these types of events. So, you know, the work that we do in Ohio really has implications, you know, nationally and internationally.
Beyond, for any inland sea like a Lake Erie or a Lake Superior or whatever,
Absolutely.
Because the attention has been focused in the past with, as you said, oceans. But you look at some of these things like Lake Erie, like the Great Lakes in general, those, especially Lake Superior, are considered basically an inland ocean. It's huge, it's deep, but because it's a lake, quote unquote, it didn't seem to get the same priority. But this now becomes a great way a tool to measure not only what's happening here, but then can be applied to locations around the world, not just here in Ohio or the United States or North America. So that's an important aspect of it. Global issue. Because one of the things I was talking with somebody before the show, and I said, you know, we have all series of travel programs, not only just on our regular channel, but the Create channel has all these travel logs, and I swear every time they put a boat in the water's green. And I'm pretty sure it didn't used to be that way. And I thought, you know, so you can see just by looking at those casual sort of travel log shows that there's algae kind of everywhere. It's not just us. We're focused because it's in our backyard, but the reality is it's a global issue, as you just said.
Absolutely.
There's a paper that came out just last month that just describes how these things have spread globally, and it attempts to address the causes of why these things are expanding. That's a well-known. It's a well-documented fact.
Right. It's just unfortunate. Like I say, it's astounding when I see every water that's green where it used to probably be clear or blue or something. So,
Absolutely.
We come back. Let's talk about the long game. Then we'll talk about that center in a little more detail and kind of get the long view of what we're going to accomplish here as well. We'll be back in just a moment. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us here. We're talking about research on Lake Erie and the Lake Erie watershed, and our guests are Dr. George Bullerjahn, Dr. Timothy Davis. We talked a little about the short game research with the one center. Tim, let's talk about the long research center that you're in charge of, basically, and what the goals are there and what the processes are for that.
Sure. So, you know, the two centers are really complementary, and the Center for Great Lakes and Watershed Studies is kind of a university-based center, right? So the university has been seeing a need to improve water quality and expand the water quality research that we do, And through that, we've hired 5 faculty members, myself included, to be able to do the type of research that we feel is necessary and create a center that's internationally known. And so that's where this Center for Great Lakes and Watershed Studies really came from. And the idea is that whereas the NIH NSF Center that George spoke about earlier is focused really in the lake, this center spans the watershed to the lake. So we're dealing with the problems in the watershed that are the drivers of the blooms in the lake, right? And if we can span that watershed to water continuum with our research, we can do a lot more. And the idea with this is that these water problems are going to be long term, right? So right now, harmful algal blooms is the hot topic, but there are going to be other water issues that we face in the future, and part of this center is to be able to get out in front of those problems.
Just to get ahead of those before we get to the point where we've unfortunately gotten here.
Instead of react, be proactive, and we know that they're coming. Issues like PFAS and other pharmaceuticals that are coming through our wastewater treatment plants because today we're more medicated than we've ever have been in history.
Now talk about not to interrupt you, but describe what PFAS are, because I don't think people are aware of that one as much as maybe we'd like them to be.
Sure. So I'm not an expert.
Digress,
I'm not an expert in PFAS by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a chemical that's found, I believe, in fire retardant, and it's is it being introduced more into our our water storage supplies, our underground water storage supplies, right? How prevalent is it? How quickly is it spreading? Where is it going to go, and how is it going to impact?
What's it going to do?
What is it going to do, right? To human health and to environmental health. So there's a lot of unknown questions there, and we've hired a faculty member, Louis Stevenson. Her job is to look at toxins of emerging concern or chemicals of emerging concern. So she'll be working on those processes. We've hired folks that are going to look at soil health, right? One of the ways in which we're going to reduce the nutrients coming into Lake Erie is through improved soil health, right? So, to get to that improved soil health, we really need to understand, for example, how do we improve that soil health, right? How do we improve the carbon content? How do we improve the microbial diversity in those soils so that we can retain more of those nutrients that we're putting on the fields in the fields?
In the fields versus them ending up
in the lake, fueling these algal blooms rather than fueling the produce that we need, and that drives a lot of Ohio's economy. So that's critically important. We also need to be able to model the watershed, understand where these best management practices for agriculture are going to be most effective, right? And which practices are going to be most effective where. And then finally, looking into the future, algal biofuels. We just hired a new assistant professor who's going to be focusing on algal biofuel research and other ways that we can use algae to our advantage, not necessarily to our disadvantage. So we're trying to expand the scope of our research, expand the depth of our research, try to understand these new problems, but also, as new problems arise, which they will, right? Because,
we're always
anytime we interact with an environment, we're going to cause these problems. So being able to be ready to help solve the next problem is the goal of this center, whether it's PFAS, whether it's another invasive species, whatever problem comes into the Great Lakes, hopefully we will be ready. We'll have a team ready.
As it happens versus well after the fact, kind of. That's a good point. Because that will hopefully get us to where we're not, as you said, not reacting. We're ahead of the curve a little bit on, as opposed to being chasing those issues a little bit.
Sure. So that's where we really want to go, and this is something that the university is heavily invested in, not just from a faculty perspective, but it's one of our pillars of research excellence. The university wants to invest a lot of internal resources in helping getting collaborations and partnerships between the faculty at the university, and then take those partnerships and expand them out to our colleagues at other universities to make BGSU a hub for water research.
And you mentioned the watershed, and that's kind of going to the source versus what we're doing in the lake in Sandusky Bay, which is where it ends up. This is to try and be there at the point of impact, the initial point where things start to get into the system. And the Maumee River, which stretches all the way back into Indiana somewhere.
Absolutely.
You've got not just the Ohio part of that watershed, but the tri-state kind of portion of it too. Is that a better arrangement now? And I know I'm asking you guys some questions that aren't necessarily science, but are we better off now with our interaction with like the state of Indiana and the state of Michigan than we were when you guys maybe first started doing this a few years ago? So is it better? We're better informed with each other than we were maybe?
Yeah, I think so.
I think so. I mean, I think people are recognizing that that this problem does not stop at
the state line or a
state
city
boundaries
border or a county line.
Any jurisdiction, right?
Right.
And in order for us to be successful at solving these issues, we're going to have to work everything down from the individual farm to cities, to states, and then multi-state, and even binational, right? These partnerships we have with Canada, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, those are absolutely critical. We need to be working together at all facets, from stakeholders all across the Great Lakes, if we're going to solve these problems, not just harmful algal blooms, but all the water quality related issues that we have in Ohio. We need to be working together, and again, these programs like H2 Ohio really highlight how important the communication and interaction between all of these different groups that are impacted by poor water quality is, and how it's going to take really a community effort to solve these issues.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there for this episode, but obviously, as you guys pursue all of this, we'll have you back, and along with your other your colleagues that are working with you on this as well. Dr. Timothy Davis, Dr. George Bullerjahn, thank you very much. Department of Biological Sciences at Bowling Green State University, focus being on improving things in the Great Lakes and the Great Lakes watershed. You can check us out at WBGU.org, and of course watch us every week here on WBGU PBS. We will see you again next time.